Muy buenos días, bienvenidos al Foro de la Sociedad Civil en el diálogo entre los voceros que representan a los ciudadanos de los países y las autoridades. Welcome everyone to this dialogue between civil society, social actors and high-level government representative. We have an amazing keynote speaker today. I'm going to be brief, but a couple of highlights about this amazing woman. She's the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Samantha Power. She leads a group of 10,000 people around the world in 100 countries. She took the position leading USAID 1 year ago, and since then she has focused on expanding efforts to end the COVID-19 pandemic, to turning USAID into a premier climate agency, working to address conflicts and humanitarian crises, and leading one of the best and most well-known faces of the United States around the world. She has an amazing career. She was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President Barack Obama. And before that position, she served as President Obama's Human Rights and Multilateral Advisor on the staff of the National Security Council at the White House. She has experience leading with huge crises and challenges around the world. Let me mention the Ebola pandemic, to the negotiations to ratify something very difficult to reach, but very successful so far, the Paris Climate Agreement, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, raising the voice of refugees, political prisoners, women's rights and girls around the world. And she's from Ireland. And prior to her political career, she was something very personal. She was a correspondent, a journalist, which disconnects immediately with my profession, my career. She was a war correspondent in Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, Zimbabwe. Tough destinations for a woman, for a journalist. She wrote many articles and books, and I think we should highlight a couple of them that are very relevant. The first one is A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. By the way, it won in 2003 the Pulitzer Prize, and a memoir called The Education of an Idealist. You're here to listen to her, not to me. So please welcome Samantha Power.
Thank you. I think they're here to listen to both of us. Good morning, everybody. Before I begin, I want to thank the Organization of American States for its role in convening this forum. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Secretary General Almagro as a steadfast defender of democracy in our hemisphere. I feel really privileged to get to engage with you in particular. There's a lot of talk this week about leaders, heads of state gathered here in Los Angeles. But in engaging with you, I feel I have an opportunity to hear directly from you who are able to channel the views, concerns, and hopes of the citizens of your countries. Non-governmental organizations represented here, universities, faith groups, professional associations, labor unions, cooperatives, community organizations, business entities. Who's going to know their countries, their communities better, right, than groups like yours, individuals like you? You represent what we all, or many of us at least, know to be true, which is a diverse civil society is essential to a healthy society. It informs citizens, monitors government policies and actions, holds government actors accountable, advocates, pushes for better policies, defends rights, and delivers essential services, especially to marginalized populations who too often fall by the wayside. And when new challenges crop up and times are tough, and Lord knows times are tough right now, with a pandemic, a growing food crisis, devastating climate shocks, job insecurity, jumps in homicides, jumps in gender-based violence, the contraction of civil liberties, which I'll talk a little more about. It is all of you who are stepping up on behalf of your communities. For decades, my organization, the United States Agency for International Development, has worked with civil society partners across Latin America and the Caribbean to help you serve your communities. And so often we see that no matter the mandate or the particular issue of the day, civil society groups are the most agile in pivoting in moments of difficulty and strain, in actually bringing that agility and that nimbleness to bear. I'll give you an example. In Ecuador, our partner, Fundación Esquel, is known as a capacity building organization for other members of civil society organizations with a famous leadership institute in Quito. But since the pandemic hit, the foundation has leveraged its nationwide network and operations to provide life-saving assistance to communities. In over 2 years, an organization that didn't used to do this kind of work has established 31 triage centers, provided oxygen therapy to over 100 people in their homes, and served more than 250,000 patients, ultimately saving hundreds of lives. As more vaccines have become available through donations from the United States and other countries, they've also pivoted again to power vaccine brigades in remote regions, helping protect over 500,000 people. Civil society organizations do this all over the world and very much in this hemisphere. And they do it for, I think, 2 main reasons. First, that proximity, the way that civil society gets close to people and individuals in need of assistance. You don't have the luxury of looking away or not paying attention to the plight of your own communities, the communities that you are living with and hearing from every day. But second, you do something which I think is essential to meet the challenges of this time, which is that you focus on the progress of the people around you, not just the programs you run and administer. You don't care if some new line of effort doesn't fall directly in line with what you've done before. When a crisis hits, as I think the example I offered shows, but as you all could illustrate as well in your own work, you break from the past and seek to deliver results in the present. You're not limited also by the expertise that lives squarely within your organizations. You build coalitions and make linkages, like you're doing here today, that are going to allow you to extend your impact. And you've never let your budgets or a lack of funding stop you from creatively finding ways to make an impact. And here's the challenge right now, right? We are never going to have enough funding to meet the needs of all the people who might benefit from assistance. We just know that. And so as creative and nimble and connected as you are to your communities, I would argue, and I'm arguing this to my own agency as well, and we are thinking through how to do this ourselves, but we all have to be even more bold in embracing new partnerships, especially with those who may not be traditional allies, but who share your goals, like working with the private sector to counter corruption or to strengthen environmental protection. In Mexico, for instance, USAID worked with the private sector to provide funds for civil society to promote open government and provide procurement transparency in the city of Chihuahua, where only 60% of all contracts were published and transparent. While some companies were benefiting from opaque processes, many were being left out altogether and saw it as being in their financial interest to hold the city accountable to more fair business practices. So there was a business incentive to actually get involved in increasing transparency. This effort resulted in a new partnership with the local organization, Carewa, and a new online platform. Monitor, it's called, which posts and assesses the corruption risk level of all publicly available contracts. As a result of Monitor now, 100% of municipal tenders are now made public, and the tool is being rolled out in 22 other cities and state governments across Mexico. In Brazil, we were inspired by the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forests, and Agriculture, which is composed of more than 300 representatives from civil society, business, finance, and academia. This unlikely coalition came together, united by a shared commitment to a low-carbon future and inclusive and sustainable land use. Through its opposition to deforestation and its public policy proposals, the coalition has emerged actually as a formidable advocate for Brazil's international climate commitments and demonstrated a path forward both in terms of economic competitiveness and environmental sustainability. In a fight to sustain democracy and expand the space for civil society, we all need to embrace partnerships like these, partnerships that 10 years ago might not have come naturally to many of us. Because in too many places, and many of you are living this personally, the work of civil society organizations is getting harder and harder. Since 2016, as you well know, according to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, 91 countries around the world have passed a total of 187 legal measures restricting the freedom of civil society. This is part of a much longer and troubling global trend that is seeing democracy on its back foot. In Latin America in particular, polling shows steadily declining levels of citizen support and satisfaction with democracy, and trust in government declining as leaders seek to shrink the space for civil society and weaken the rule of law. These abstract trends, these statistics have real-world, real-life consequences, with civil society increasingly under threat. Javier Tarazona, director of the Venezuelan NGO Fundaredes, recently completed 11 months in prison, falsely accused of terrorism and treason for denouncing links between the authorities and illegal armed groups. Javier's detention did not happen by accident. It follows a troubling pattern of democratic decline and erosion of the separation of powers, silencing of the free press, persecution of critics, manipulation of elections, jailing of opponents. You know what is happening. Venezuela is, of course, an extreme case, but it is not the only one. To Javier Tarazona's name, we can add those of Cuban human rights activists, Jose Daniel Ferrer, and the Nicaraguan opposition leader, Violeta Granera Padilla, and too many others persecuted simply for speaking the truth. Worryingly, in the Americas today, we've seen more countries taking steps to limit the operations of civil society organizations, to attack the press, or to capture the courts. And I want to be clear, of course, my country, the United States, is not at all immune from these forces seeking to undermine liberal democracy and an open society. A toxic brew of political polarization and online disinformation have given rise to extremist voices and, as you well know, political violence, some of it aimed at our very own democratic system. President Biden convened a summit for democracy in December, not because US democracy or any democracy has the answers, but because of the urgent need to lock arms and push back against authoritarian trends. This is the work we need to do together to preserve the space for civil society as an essential engine of democracy and development. And we especially need to support civil society in the places that are bucking the trends and experiencing efforts at democratic reform, like in the Dominican Republic, where a new government was elected on the very promise of tackling endemic corruption. It is civil society who are sustaining these pro-democratic movements, journalists and activists who helped expose corruption, citizen movements demanding gender ethnic and marriage equality, even demanding in Chile a new constitution to enshrine these principles. And courageous NGOs like Foro Penal, working in less forgiving circumstances in Venezuela to stand up to government abuse, to document and denounce Javier Tarazóna's detention and those of 236 other political prisoners. So the world's democracies must do more to support civil society because the forces aligned against are getting more and more sophisticated. They are using new tools, new technologies, big data, spyware, artificial intelligence to spy on citizens, to track members of civil society, and to preserve and expand their power. And they are increasingly using weaponized propaganda and disinformation, often originating by authoritarians beyond our hemisphere itself, to divide societies and to manipulate elections. In parts of Central America specifically, we see an accelerating contraction in civic space propelled by the enactment of repressive or ambiguous laws, the erosion of judicial independence, limitations on access to public information, criminalization and spurious litigation, smear campaigns, including against some of you in this room, and digital tools of repression like, again, disinformation and misinformation. These trends threaten not just democratic principles such as freedom of expression and association, but regional stability and prosperity for all of our countries. The United States deeply believes that when civil society is free to flourish, governments are more accountable, and thus they perform better. Citizens are more invested in their communities, and problems big and small are more likely to get solved. For this reason, today I'm pleased to announce a new U.S. government initiative. As part of the Biden-Harris administration's strategy to address the root causes of migration in Central America, we are launching VOCES, the VOCES initiative, Voices, to preserve, protect, and defend civic space in Central America. Under this Voices initiative, we will work with like-minded partners to focus on three critical challenges. First, we will promote digital democracy and seek to counter digital authoritarianism. Second, Voices will promote freedom of expression and strengthen independent media. And third, we will work to counter this increasing trend of trying to criminalize civil society actors, providing them with enhanced physical, digital, and legal protection. We are initially devoting over $40 million to these objectives in Central America. But again, the initiative is not just about funding new programs, it is also about mobilizing partnerships to achieve progress. So we will be elevating our private and public diplomacy in defense of civil society, partnering with willing governments in the region and beyond. We will engage more deeply with the tech companies using our on-the-ground presence in countries throughout the region and our relationships with all of you to hold up a mirror to Silicon Valley and describe the real-world harm that social media platforms are too often causing. We will more closely partner with civil society to channel your concerns and evidence to sanctioning authorities and consider the adoption of rights-violating NGO laws or their arbitrary application, a form of anti-democratic behavior in determining visa ineligibilities and other relevant sanctions. And we will work with the Financial Action Task Force so that countries are not unduly hindering legitimate NGO activities under the guise of counter-terrorist financing laws. As the Inter-American Democratic Charter states, it is the right and responsibility of all citizens to participate in decisions relating to their own development. I would encourage all of you to expand your circle of allies to deliver progress for your citizens, and know that USAID will be behind you. We will be an ally working with you to try to foster dialogue, coordination, and collaboration with public institutions and political leaders committed to democratic principles. Thank you so much, and now I'm eager for our conversation. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. If I can...
Please, of course you can.
Thank you. This is a conversation between you and the government.
I'm the government.
And the government. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, but please think your questions, be ready, and there is a mic in the middle of the corridor. Be precise and straight to the point in your questions so we can take as many questions as possible. But let me start with something that is not well known of Ms. Power in her agenda when she travels around the world. She always asks her staff to put meetings with civil society first and before politicians or policymakers. And this is why she has grown with this title of person who listened to the civil society. I would like to start with that. If you could share, what do you hear from these voices when you travel around the world? What is a pattern that it's always the same, that it's something not connected with the societies and their politicians or policymakers?
Well, first of all, thank you to you for the work that you do every day to hold all of us to account. As a former journalist, I'm very committed to being held accountable, and so I look forward to the back and forth here. On that question, I would just say that so there are two aspects of it. First of all, I think every U.S. official needs to get out of the bubble, away from the talking points, away from the glossy brochures and the claims about what governments are doing, and talk to people who are on the front lines who are dealing with everything from again, climate shocks and the economic aftermath of that, to the kinds of restrictive NGO laws or the co-option of an attorney general's office or a Supreme Court, that we're seeing the roundup of political prisoners. You have to get ground truth. And, I know from being now a government official, having been an activist, that when you're in government, you're just by definition further away from the ground truth, so you have to work harder to get it. So meeting with civil society is just, as a matter of course, you wouldn't go to a country and expect, to understand what's happening in any particular community simply by hearing a government official's representation of that. So I just would come as a journalist with that kind of skepticism. But the reason I always do it first, or seek to do it first, is I want to be able to take what I hear and bring it into the government officials, because, in too many parts of the world, and especially now as governments are feeling more vulnerable, maybe with some of the economic shocks, or themselves are more interested in some cases with their own personal power, their distance from civil society is growing greater. And so sometimes, even though I'm an interloper from another country who can't claim to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination, I can be a messenger. I can be a vehicle for the aspirations or the often very grave concerns about the people that I've met with. And sometimes, and again, this is a little abstract because we're not talking about specific countries or circumstances, but sometimes when I convey something that I have heard directly from, for example, an anti-corruption investigator who has just been harassed or intimidated, you'll see the leader looking to their ministers and be like, what's she talking about? Sometimes you'll see the leader, just spewing misinformation about, and knowing full well, because the leader has himself, encouraged that kind of harassment and intimidation. So I think that's a role that the United States can play, is that sometimes we have access that is now shriveling up for civil society organizations, and we need to use that access on behalf of the concerns that the citizens of the country are experiencing, and real-time information and real facts.
Do they get angry when they hear the truth that they don't want to hear?
Again, it depends on the leadership. I mean, again, I was using in my remarks the example of Silicon Valley and going to the tech companies who say, oh, well, we have this number of people who are monitoring content, and we have this framework for deciding what is on this side of the line in terms of incitement to violence, or where to draw the lines in terms of misinformation that's harmful to health. And you go out and in the countries in which we work and ask civil society to give their sense of whether there's anyone they can call to report when something that seems like incitement to violence against a transgender person appears on the internet, and they're like, we don't know what they're talking about. We've never heard of the structures that they think exist. And so that's not a head of state and their reaction, but sometimes at high levels, the companies are caught off guard because they believe their own internal, everybody reports up, right? Everybody wants to get a good grade. And so you can provide that kind of ground truth. And I think something analogous happens with leaders. If a leader is actually interested in, for example, providing social services or vaccines or let's say a subsidy for fertilizer now in light of the food crisis, I think on the socio-economic space, they kind of want to hear when things aren't working the way they thought they were working, the way their ag minister might be reporting, because I think they get elected, promising to be able to deliver economically. I think what they like, and I'm generalizing, but like a lot less, is any implication that they are moving in a repressive direction. No one likes to hear that. And I don't think I've ever had the experience of a government being like, what a good point. We really need to we need to dial back our repression, because that kind of thing just generally doesn't happen without a leader himself feeling vulnerable or so desperate to perpetuate his own power, to consolidate his own power. It just doesn't happen by accident.
Voy a pedir que quien quiera tomar la palabra, aquí está el micrófono mientras os vais preparando los que deseen hacer alguna pregunta o intervención. You have many roles in your career. You've been a journalist, a human rights activist, a writer, and this is something that has in common one thing, at least, which is being critic with the power. In this particular case, in your career with US power. How do you reconcile these roles when you took the position of representing the US government? How do you let this writer, journalist, or human rights activist influence in your decisions when you lead the agency now?
Well, I'd say two things in the spirit of also how to enhance collaboration with the kinds of organizations that are represented here. I mean, first, there's nothing more important than telling a story effectively. Some of you are journalists, you're a journalist. You know the difference. You know when you have told a story in a manner that reaches the audience that you are targeting. And in government, especially in this media environment with all the disinformation, it's really hard to tell the story, for example, these days about democracy being a better form of government. It's so easy in times of chaos and crisis for people to think that the strong man, will impose order, when murder rates are going up or fuel and food prices are going up, to think that there's going to be some quick fix. And that's what so many leaders in the hemisphere are promising, is some quick fix for issues that are structural. So we who believe and care about democracy, care about human rights, we have to tell the story not only of the kind of moral outrage of rights being repressed, but the practical impact of denying citizens' ability to hold leaders accountable. That's just going to be bad for economic returns, just as it is for, but stories and again, public human faces, capturing the human consequences is really important, which is something civil society actors, I think, often do better than governments, but each of us have a lot of progress that we have to make on that. And then the second thing I'd say is, I would encourage, and I know that in the hemisphere this doesn't happen, or in the Americas it doesn't happen as often as it happens in the United States, but more people in civil society to go into government. Because the truth is, I mean, others will say she's changed, she's different, she's now, has to defend this or that, that is at odds with maybe something that she might have written, 15 years ago. I mean, there's no question when you're in a government, you're part of a team, you don't get to have your own foreign policy or your own agenda per se, but you have your own agenda inside the government that you get to push. And my agenda today is the same agenda I had when I was blasting the US government, for what it was doing here or there, insofar as I'm still trying to stand up for human rights, still trying to push for human consequences to be center stage in how we think about our foreign policy. The difference now is I'm at USAID and I have these tools that go beyond my pen to be able to try to, for example, support journalists who have to go into exile because their government is locking them up, or support anti-corruption crusaders with legal insurance so that they can't get sued. Now I have those tools, but the only way to have those tools is also to be part of a team, and you fight the good fight inside government. Sometimes you don't prevail, and yet the benefit is that you get access to resources that I just didn't have when I was in civil society to support my partners and my friends.
First question, please introduce yourself. You can use Spanish or English if you want, and straight to the point.
Ok, lo voy a hacer en español para que más fácil.
Just 1 second.
Cintia, ok.
Go ahead.
¿Ya? Cintia Deza, directora de Ciudadanas y Ciudadanos por la Transparencia, US Grantee in Quintana Roo, en Cancún, exactly. I have, quisiera saber tu punto de vista en dos temas. Uno que además no he escuchado en esta cumbre y que me parecen muy, muy relevantes. El primero, ¿qué está pasando con los compromisos de Lima? Nosotros trabajamos en temas de anticorrupción y son estructurales a todos los otros problemas que se están aquí discutiendo y existen muy, muy pocos avances. Entonces, desde donde hemos estado aquí discutiendo el tema de la corrupción y los avances de los compromisos previos, no se ha dado seguimiento, no sabemos que, los gobiernos no están cumpliendo y no está pasando nada. ¿Cómo se puede utilizar esta cumbre y específicamente a la OEA para empujar esta agenda? Y la segunda, que tampoco he escuchado una discusión, ¿cómo la OEA puede ayudar a fortalecer a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil? Estamos aquí virtiendo toda la gran cantidad de problemáticas que tenemos entre nosotros, pero no con las autoridades, no con las personas que están tomando los procesos de decisión, y no estamos discutiendo cómo la OEA puede ser como el altavoz de la ciudadanía. Muchas gracias.
If you agree, let's take 3 questions all together.
That's great.
Okay, second question, please. Introduce yourself and straight to the point.
Yes. Hi, good morning, Ms. Powers. Thank you for being here. My name is Scarlett Lansais. I represent a nonprofit organization in Miami called Accountable Impact. And what we do is we advance the 2030 agenda. So my question and my comment it's in regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. As he mentioned when he was introducing you, you worked in developing the SDGs. I wanted to say 2 things. One, just recently the UN announced that there's 5 countries that have never submitted a voluntary national review. 4 of those are in conflict. Those are Yemen, Myanmar, Haiti, and South Sudan. The 5th is the US. So I want to hear from you what the federal government is planning to do in advancing the SDGs in the US. There's many efforts throughout the world in doing local voluntary reviews, right? And I specifically want to mention this because, as I said, it's Agenda 2030. We have 7 years left to meet those 17 goals that are focused on environmental protection, economic growth, and social progress. And as we're talking about development, whether it's human rights, gender equality, climate action, I think that U.S. needs to step up and advance the SDGs, because as you well know, they were approved in 2015 by 193 countries, one of them being the US. So I would love to hear from you how USAID or any other federal entity is planning to advance the SDGs in the US, and also what they're doing abroad, specifically in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last one for this first round.
Sí, mi nombre es Graciela Dubrés. Soy de Argentina, Observatorio Internacional de Prisiones, defensora de los derechos humanos de las personas privadas de su libertad. Me alegra mucho haber escuchado a la señora que se define como defensora de los derechos humanos. Como todos sabemos, las Américas, son los continentes más desiguales en posibilidades económicas que existen. Y eso se refleja quienes entramos a las prisiones y vemos que las prisiones están absolutamente pobladas de personas analfabetas funcionales, quienes sabiendo leer y escribir no comprenden el proceso judicial, nunca han tenido los derechos que se le otorga desde la Constitución, desde las convenciones internacionales, pero sí le cae por la cabeza el derecho penal. Entonces, aquí tenemos que empezar por la raíz del problema. ¿Cómo podemos en las Américas hacer un nuevo pacto para la redistribución de la riqueza y que por lo menos todos los habitantes y ciudadanos de las Américas tengan derecho a la vida, pero no únicamente a la vida con dignidad, porque sin la dignidad, sin las necesidades básicas satisfechas, es inútil que piensen si hay autoritarismo o no hay autoritarismo. Como defensora de los derechos humanos en mi país, yo he sido crítica del gobierno anterior, soy crítica de este gobierno y seguro de que vendrá, porque los que defendemos los derechos humanos siempre tenemos claro que el que viola los derechos humanos por definición es el gobierno, si no es un conflicto entre particulares.
Vamos a darle la palabra para que escuche. Entiendo que su pregunta es cómo poder conseguir un acuerdo en las Américas para garantizar la redistribución de la riqueza y asegurar la vida y el derecho de los ciudadanos. ¿Correcto? Muchísimas gracias. Let's go with these first questions.
Okay, great, thank you. Maybe I'll just go backwards if I can, just starting with the last question. You know, I took in the question or in the discussion that was part of the question a little bit of pushback on my emphasis on repression and infringements on civil and political rights, not because you don't care about those things, of course, but rather stressing the importance of greater equality and the enjoyment of social and economic rights. I took that as sort of part of what was animating the question. And let me just say that, for starters, if you look at places in the hemisphere that are cracking down, locking up journalists, political prisoners, including in prisons with horrific conditions along the lines that you've described, it is not the case that you're seeing, you know, economic programs that are delivering inclusive economic growth or a concern for society writ large rooted in economic dignity. You know, the economic mismanagement of the economies in countries that are experiencing you know, dramatic democratic backsliding or repression, you know, that link is by and large there, and we could go country by country, but you know those countries well. That said, you know, I feel very, very blessed to be part of USAID because our programs really are aimed at thinking about dignity in the fullest sense. The dignity and agency that you have to exercise your political rights, to hold your leaders accountable. If you don't like your leader, to be able to vote them out of office through free and fair elections. We're for all that. And the governance and rule of law that needs to undergird that. But at the same time, you know, we are now, and there'll be announcements here in the coming days around the food security crisis. You know, there is no dignity in seeing your crops washed away because of flooding or unable to be harvested because you don't have fuel to actually get them to market because the prices are so high. So we can't afford to focus on one part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without emphasis on the other if we are thinking about individual, community, and national health in the broadest sense. And so too, on something like COVID, we at USAID in our missions around the region, we have seen that it is, and just as was true in the United States, it is the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the poorest who paid the greatest price, both in the health space in terms of morbidity, but also in terms of the economic fallout from the pandemic. And so, I think this emphasis on equitable recovery, and as President Biden would say, building back better, embedding greater attention to equality in our programming and in our dialogues with government is absolutely key. Second, on the Sustainable Development Goals, thank you for your work on the SDGs. I did have the privilege as UN Ambassador of negotiating the SDGs to conclusion. And we see at our 80 missions around the world, many of which are in the hemisphere, how important the SDGs have been in organizing social and economic development planning, in organizing thinking around transition to renewable energies or adaptation to the most pernicious effects on climate change, in organizing drives to create parity among girls and boys in terms of education or to make a push on clean water. And again, every country itself has the sovereign right to decide how to prioritize among the goals, all of which are linked to each other. And you're right, we are running out of time. And we're not only running out of time, we have seen dramatic setbacks. At just the time, but if there weren't for the pandemic, now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and all of the food fallout from that, compounding the climate crisis and the pandemic-induced economic effects, we are seeing dramatic development setbacks on everything from childhood vaccination to girls' education to sort of basic poverty numbers. Indeed, the ultimate measure of the SDGs and whether we're enjoying them, you might say, is life expectancy, right? Like all those SDGs, if we were making progress, would lead to greater life expectancy. We are seeing the first declines in life expectancy in nearly a century. Declines. So I just want you to know that the United States works in every country with countries who have developed their national action plans or their SDG plans. I don't have anything to announce about the US's own plan, but I very much take the point that orienting our own domestic work on climate change, on equitable growth, on education, on bridging the digital divide, that there would be great benefit to framing some of that in the SDG context. But right now we are working with countries, we USAID, the domestic is not my domain, but we are working with countries in helping them implement their plans. Just very briefly on corruption, I gave a big speech yesterday, as it happens, on democracy and anti-corruption and all that the United States is doing, much of which is happening here in the hemisphere. And I think you'll see a blueprint and a roadmap emerging from this week at the Summit of the Americas on corruption. The Voices initiative that I mentioned, which is a new initiative which will provide $40 million in funding for organizations that, yes, are fighting criminalization of NGOs, but also are documenting corruption, working across borders in a way that organizations have done more rarely than is ideal. Funding that kind of transnational anti-corruption work is a critical element of it. And the last thing I'd mention is just we created something called Reporters Mutual, which is a fund. We, USAID, have created this, and we're seeking additional donor and foundation and private sector support. But it's a fund to help journalists who are doing anti-corruption work and civil society organizations as needed, but actually insure themselves, because the corrupt actor's weapon, in addition to violence and harassment, is increasingly the lawsuit. And so we want to make sure that journalists who are doing the anti-corruption work know that they will be able to defend civil or even criminal lawsuits. And in order for that to happen, they have to be insured. So USAID is now trying to look at that as a structural issue and create a pool of funding that journalists who do that work would be able to access.
We are running out of time. We have a couple of minutes. I know many questions are on the list. Let's take two, very quick, please, and with your quick answers.
If you would like to even hear, we could hear from maybe at least four of the people in line, or just so we get their voices in the conversation. Then I'll do my best to.
Your staff is not killed.
They're not like it. They're not going to kill.
So
but if they could be brief, and I'll try to be brief too.
4 questions, but help yourself being straight to the point. Go ahead.
Very quick. Good morning. Thank you for doing this, Ambassador. I'm Nora Games with the Miami Herald. A lot of Biden's policy towards the region focuses on Central America, but you yourself mentioned this concerning trends, and several leaders skipped the summit. So my question is, how can you expect advancing the president's agenda on migration, anti-corruption, defending democracy when these leaders don't even want to engage with the U.S.? Thank you.
Thank you, Nora.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Thank you for your work and your remarks. My name is Marian Adeney. I'm the Director of Amazon and Fire Programs at Conservation X Labs and former AAAS Fellow at USAID. In my work in the Amazon, we see that many of the most severe drivers of deforestation and degradation are closely linked to corruption and organized crime, and that both legal and illegal investments in destructive activities dwarf the funding for sustainable development and conservation. So I wonder if you could just comment a bit on the role of USAID working across governments and the private sector to advance environmental governance as a tool for attaining sustainable development goals and protecting both communities and ecosystems in the Amazon and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name is Romero Lopez. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak to you, such as civil society. My question is, as a human rights protector or activist, I started long ago protesting in the streets, and then further on, I started going to the senators and so on and so forth to get sanctions for Nicaragua, and I've been in protest for Venezuela and Cuba as well. So my question is, what else can we do as a civil society to continue? Nicaragua and Venezuela, we don't have a voice over there, so we are the voices of these people. So what is your suggestion for us to continue doing at this point? Muchísimas gracias. Viva Nicaragua.
Good morning, Ms. Power. Thank you for your statement. My name is Almiracle Senfor. I represent the private sector inside a civil society organization under the name of La Paix. We are in peace building throughout Dialogue. And my question is regarding Haiti. As you know, we have a dictator. The main dictator is corruption. Corruption creates insecurity, gang violence, and there's no business environment. And I know in US we have a tool, the Global Magnitsky Act. Do you know its application can give a good result on the region, especially in Haiti? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
4 questions.
Yeah, I won't be able to do justice to the 4 questions just in the time we have left. But let me just say a couple things. First, starting at the end there, I think what's really important for the United States to do as a very influential player in the hemisphere on issues of democracy and human rights, but also in terms of economic equality, economic dignity, is we have to think expansively about the toolkit that we have to support the objectives that you all are working for every day. And so I very much hear the point about the Magnitsky Act. For those who don't know, this is a piece of legislation that allows us to sanction human rights abusers. We also have sanctions designations that are done, again, under, as I mentioned in my remarks, under the anti-corruption rubric. People who are interfering with the ability to hold democratic elections. So I think it's a tool, right, alongside some of the other tools. On the Amazon, you know, what USAID and other actors try to do is not only support conservation organizations and reforestation or the prevention of deforestation, but you know, I think it's also the work that we do in the hemisphere, and I'll broaden it from the Amazon, but around election integrity and the importance of free and fair elections is really important as well, because what is the biggest predictor of what is going to happen in the Amazon is ultimately, you know, not what even a country as powerful as the United States thinks should happen in the Amazon, but it's who gets elected and their perspective on environmental conservation and their commitments to combating climate change or to protecting a country's natural treasures, natural resources. We've lived in the United States in the previous administration what it means to turn one's back on conservation and turn one's back on combating climate change. And now we have to make up for lost time. But I just want to stress, and this may be the question about what can be done about Venezuela, Nicaragua, places where regimes have cracked down so brutally, Cuba. You know, at the end of the day, we know that there is a silent majority of people who may not be able to exercise their voice, may not be able to participate in an election. Indeed, in Nicaragua, of course, all of the election candidates jailed one after the other. So great was the fear of allowing the opposition to participate. So great is the fear of protests in Cuba that this draconian crackdown denies people even the ability to express their views on how the government is handling COVID or spiraling food prices. So that will is out there, and you know, I think what is really important for people who've been forced into exile is to continue to support people who are inside, doing the work that is so dangerous and so brave every day, but also lifting up your voices to try to build an even more expansive coalition here in the Americas. And that's where I'll finish, is with the first question, which is, you know, was about, you know, how can we advance, you know, this broad set of objectives on human rights and democracy when, you know, certain leaders haven't been invited who aren't themselves practicing or respecting democratic principles. What I'd say is there are a lot of countries here today that have real leverage in the hemisphere. There are vast economies that are gathered here in Los Angeles this week who, you know, have the capacity within their own borders to show that democracy works, to, you know, do procurement in a more transparent way, to allow their citizens more space to raise their voices. No country, you know, has a monopoly on good values or on respect for human rights. Every country has progress that can be made, and including, of course, the one that we're in right now. I mean, we all have to be strengthening our election systems, have to be fighting misinformation, have to be strengthening independent media, have to be lifting up the voices of civil society. So there's plenty of work to be done here today. The climate shocks that so many in the hemisphere are suffering, particularly in the Caribbean, but not only in the Caribbean, there's plenty of work that we need to do with the Inter-American Development Bank and international financial institutions to draw more resources into climate mitigation, climate adaptation. We have a thick agenda, and all of that agenda, I think, if it comes together, if we resource it, if we make clear the centrality of respecting human rights to the kind of inclusive economic growth that most leaders say they are for, you know, this can be an inflection point in the hemisphere. This can be an inflection point, a time where we agreed on a set of challenges, where we're facing an unprecedented set of challenges, arguably, that are all coming together in a kind of perfect storm. But we came together and decided we were going to do things differently and mobilize additional resources and recognize that civil society is not the problem. Civil society is central to the solution in handling those crises. And there are plenty, again, there is a critical mass of really important leaders of civil society organizations, leaders of countries, and together, all of you, again, have a role to play in bringing a new level of ambition to tackling this set of interlocking crises in the hemisphere. Thank you so much.
Samantha Powell, U.S. Administrator for the U.S. International Development Agency. Thank you for your time,
Thank
for
you.
your answers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sé que había varias preguntas pendientes, no tenemos más tiempo, pero no se vayan. Nos espera el secretario Blinken, nos esperan otras autoridades, los responsables de la política exterior de Canadá, de Panamá, el presidente de Colombia estará con nosotros. En 20 minutos reanudamos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.